There's a new poll out that shows that Albertans are really concerned about oil and gas environmental liabilities, as well they should be. We've been working on this story for years, and folks, it is I need a word bigger than ginormous. That's how big this problem is. I'm going to be talking to Philip Meinzer, who from the Albertans for Responsible Energy, and we're going to discuss the poll and its interesting results. So welcome to the interview, Phil.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Markham. Nice to see you.
Give us a little bit, just give us a brief overview of this Janet Brown opinion research poll. And by the way, let's say make the point up front that Janet Brown is one of the most respected pollsters in Alberta. This is good, solid polling, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's part of why we went to Janet. So yeah, our coalition, the Coalition for Responsible Energy, we commissioned Janet Brown to do a survey of sort of Albertans' opinions across three different polling questions, all related to essentially the oil and gas industry paying for costs that it should be responsible for. And what we saw is just overwhelming support from Albertans across the province who want to see the oil and gas industry held accountable for these costs.
Yeah, and one of the issues here is that the industry and the government, the Alberta government, can keep telling Albertans, have told Albertans for decades that this is the most ethical, most environmentally responsible industry on the planet, basically. It's the greenest, on and on. When you do reporting like we have done and you talk to the scientists and the folks behind the story, you look at the data and it's exactly the opposite story. And there seems to be finally people are waking up and saying, whoa, we have got a really big problem here. So the level of understanding and the urgency of that to do something seems to be increasing. Does that show up in the survey results?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we can talk to maybe trends in sort of public opinion and sort of like the bigger picture after. But like what we saw from the survey is we asked three questions around essentially holding the oil and gas industry responsible for paying for different costs, not just on the cleanup side. So yes, we want to see industry pay for cleanup, and we saw overwhelming support for industry paying for cleanup. But we also saw support for having the industry cover unpaid municipal property taxes and unpaid compensation to landowners. And, people might be thinking, well, duh, these companies should obviously be paying these costs because they're supposed to be responsible for them already. But what's interesting is that the way the questions were worded is we were specifically asking about having industry as a whole cover these costs. So, like when an individual company, let's say, fails to pay, industry as a whole should share that cost or pay that burden, kind of like how Alberta's orphan fund is supposed to work, but doesn't necessarily always work that way.
And there's another side of this, and one of your members, Mark Dorn, has said this in interviews with Energy Media repeatedly, and that is there's unpaid taxes. That's one issue, but then individual landowners who have wells on their property are meant to be compensated for the loss of the use of that land, surface rights payments, and very often they're not. And when they're not, there's a fund paid for by Alberta taxpayers that pays that landowner. So not only are the oil companies not cleaning up their liabilities, but the taxpayer is paying because they don't, which is basically a subsidy to the industry.
Yeah, that's exactly what we were trying to get at with the thrust of that question around unpaid compensation to landowners. Because, yeah, on the one hand, companies aren't paying municipal taxes to a lot of rural municipalities, but you're right. When landowners don't get paid by companies for that compensation that they're owed, they're allowed to apply through the government to get that compensation, and that just means all of us pay that. And the Narwhal recently reported that over the last 10 years, taxpayers have essentially paid around $150 million for companies not paying what they're supposed to these landowners.
Yeah, right. And let's talk about some of the numbers because the numbers are actually staggering. There's about 475,000 oil and gas wells in Alberta. And then remember, this is not the oil sands. This is just conventional oil and gas. And about there's 80,000 on the inactive list. These are wells that have been decommissioned, but they haven't been reclaimed. There's another 150,000 wells that are marginal, which means they produce less than 10 barrels a day, and they're going to become inactive in the very near future. Then there are some other wells, I forget the number exactly, but they're wells that are that still need reclamation. And the altogether, it's like 300,000 wells,
Yeah,
2/3 of the number. I mean, the number is, and that doesn't mean cover 440,000 kilometers of pipeline and 40 or 50,000 facilities and on and on. It's just staggering.
totally. Yeah, it's massive. And like you're saying, this is just on the conventional side of the industry, not even including the oil sands. There's a ton of infrastructure and a ton of land disturbance that needs to get cleaned up at some point, and companies are supposed to be paying for that.
I want to float an idea here that I've written about this before, Phil, and I think it needs to be uh, made more forcefully. In my opinion, the oil and gas industry has no intention to pay to clean up its liabilities. And the reason I say this is because I mean, give Danielle Smith's provincial government its due. For the first time a couple of years ago, it began requiring companies to spend. The global figure was around seven. It was started at $450 million a year. Now it's up to $700 million a year. They have to spend on cleaning up the wells. That's never been done before. So at least now there's that. But that doesn't begin to cut into the backlog. It barely covers the, sort of annual additions. And the whole system is set up for these companies to be able to kick the can down the road. And you can see where this is going. Eventually, demand will start to fall and they'll become unprofitable. They'll go bankrupt, and the taxpayer will be stuck with hundreds of billions of dollars to clean up their mess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, billions and billions of dollars. Like, depending on whose estimates you use, anywhere from maybe on the low end, $40 billion to as high as like 260 billion if you include oil sands, pipelines, facilities, all that stuff. It's just, yeah, it's a massive amount of money that could fall on the public if we don't collect this money as soon as possible, while these companies are still profitable.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I know you gave the range, and at the bottom of it, let's acknowledge that's the Alberta Energy Regulator number, which is everybody agrees is vastly underestimated.
Right.
But the other number that you gave, 260 billion, is also comes from the Alberta Energy Regulator. Out of 2018, it was a part of the regulator. They started that they authorized to do a study, and it was leaked. It was leaked after a public presentation, and that is $260 billion. And I think and I'll see what you think about this, Phil, but I think we should always assume the worst case here, not
Yeah,
the best case.
yeah, I agree. And even like Martin Olzinski, who I think has been on your show before, from the University of Calgary, he's then sort of like adjusted that for inflation to make it, I think it's over $300 billion, and that would wipe out about 60% of the resource royalties we would have ever received if we don't get that money for cleanup.
Yeah, it's one of those wicked problems that is so big you just can't get your head around it. But nevertheless, these are issues that the Alberta public and frankly the Canadian public has to grapple with, because Alberta could never pay to clean this up itself. It will
Yeah.
fall on the Canadian taxpayer if the industry doesn't do it. So one of the things that I found interesting about this story, Phil, is the rural municipalities of Alberta has emerged as the association. It has emerged as one of the critics of the industry for not, holding up its end of the bargain. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, this gets at like the idea of whether these companies or the industry as a whole are sort of losing social license in the province. Yeah, it's great to see the rural municipalities. They recently, put out their own criticism of the government's new cleanup scheme, or we're calling it like a drill and dash scheme, the mature asset strategy. So they've put out public criticisms of the government's plans for cleanup. They want to weaken reclamation standards, push more costs onto taxpayers. So yeah, good to see more criticisms and critiques coming from different, let's say, constituencies across the province. And it's also cool that the findings we saw in this poll is that there was consistent support for holding the industry accountable across the province. So regardless of geography, so you're seeing people in urban centers like Calgary and Edmonton, but also across the rest of the province, consistent support for holding industry accountable for all of these costs. Albertans want to see the industry pay what they owe here.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the Alberta government, we've consistently made this criticism of first under the UCP under Jason Kenney, then under current Premier Danielle Smith, is basically carrying water for the industry and shielding it from criticism. And meanwhile, they pretend to be putting in place measures to fix the problem. And so you mentioned the scheme you mentioned is called the mature asset strategy, and it started life under Danielle Smith before she became premier, when she was an oil and gas lobbyist, literally a registered lobbyist, and she was promoting R-Star, which
Yeah,
would have cost the taxpayers about $6 billion of cash, foregone taxes, to clean up some of these assets.
right.
And it was so unpopular when she floated it that she had to pull back and say, no, 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 we're going to do a little pilot project. Well, and then it came back as this reborn mature asset strategy, but it's essentially R-Star in a different package, isn't it?
Yeah, and from folks who I know who are a little bit more familiar with R-Star, they're saying that the mature asset strategy is R-Star but worse. I mean, it's yeah, there's a lot of sort of get out of cleanup free cards for the industry in there, and like you said, it was driven largely by industry. The process that created the mature asset strategy was a closed door process, no public consultation, led by an industry consultant, David Yeager, and I think 70 of the 90 something participants were just oil and gas reps. So the cleanup plan that's being drafted here is really just, a way to let industry off the hook here and push more of those costs onto us.
Yeah, let's talk about David Yeager for a minute because we've tangled with him a little bit. David Yeager used to run, he's a service company executive on and off over his career. He used to publish the Roughneck magazine. So he has deep roots in the industry. He used to be the president of the Wild Rose Party when back in 2011, 2012, when Danielle Smith was the leader of the Wild Rose Party. And he's since become basically her right-hand guy when it comes to oil and gas issues, sort of her fixer. And so he's done a variety of uncompetitive contracts that he's been given to do things, and including the mature asset strategy. And now this is interesting. He wrote it. He's responsible for it. And then he was appointed by Smith to sit on the board of the Alberta Energy Regulator, which is the organization that will be implementing the mature asset strategy. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's a conflict, a serious conflict of interest.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, even like that conflict of interest, his multiple roles while drafting this strategy that is essentially going to change or proposing to change, public policy and legislation in Alberta, it's been flagged to the ethics commissioner by EcoJustice and one of the landowners who's a participant in sort of our coalition, Dwight Popovich. So yeah, I agree. It's a massive conflict of interest and should be a red flag for all Albertans.
So where do we go from here, Phil? We've argued here at Energy Media that the long-term sustainability of the industry is to get its environmental liabilities issue under control. I mean, that it has to start living up. The industry has to start living up to the hype, which it certainly isn't now. So, what you've got the survey now that shows that Albertans are clearly on side with holding the industry to account to pay for its mess, to clean up its mess. What next?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we're consistently trying to answer that. Like, what level of public backlash or public opinion convinces this provincial government to sort of change course still remains to be seen. We've talked a little bit about sort of trends in the liabilities issue. Maybe public is learning more and more about how big the problem is, and I think part of this work is getting more people on side to realize that subsidies to the oil and gas industry like impact the rest of our lives in different ways. Like our coalition has been running this Clean Up Your Mess campaign over the last few months. We've had town halls across the province where we've had people in rural communities show up, people in urban centers, all show up to learn and then express their dissatisfaction with the route this government is taking on this issue. But connecting this to the broader issues, like let's say not having say the government saying they don't have enough money for teachers or other public services, is like one of these ways that we hope that more Albertans will get involved and engaged and push back, because you can't on the one hand say you don't have money for our public services, don't have money to sort of better resource teachers, hospitals, but then propose to let the oil and gas industry walk away from cleanup and make us pay, or to make us pay when they're not compensating landowners appropriately. So I think that's the work that needs to be done. Like we have to reach some sort of critical mass that maybe pushes the government off track, but also reaching people who would normally be part of this government's base. That's why we're going to rural Alberta. That's why this polling is really cool. It shows folks across rural Alberta also agree that industry should pay. I mean, I've had the privilege of speaking to rural landowners. They're equally as upset because they live with this infrastructure on their land. And it's, I think, just avoiding making this like a political issue or a bipartisan political issue, and just showing that we're all in the same fight here. And in all cases, that this government is just putting industry above Albertans.
Yeah, and I'm going to close the interview with this point, Phil. In the academic literature, there is a concept of organizations and governments being captured. And this is it's widely acknowledged that the Alberta Energy Regulator is a captured regulator, and that this government is a captured government. It's been captured by the oil and gas industry. What does that mean? It means that the government and the regulator conflate the industry interest with the public interest. It's like, back in the days in the United States in the 50s, they used to say, what's good for General Motors is good for the United States. It's like what's good for the oil and gas industry is good for Alberta. And then we'll excuse all manner of sins because, we think that there's a benefit. That's captured. And this is a captured government and a captured regulator. And that's a point I think that has to be made over and over.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. More and more people need to just like recognize that that's the case here.
Phil, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Always a pleasure to come on. Thanks, Markham.